much better able to survive and even thrive often during this pandemic. A lot of smaller businesses going under, some of them relying on government borrowing, so the government basically lending to them to prop them up. And that basically this borrowing scheme, the bounce back loan scheme, has been administered by private banks. And a lot of those banks have said up to 50% of the businesses who've borrowed in this way could default when this scheme ends. So the government has a bit of a challenge there as to what it's going to do about those small businesses, which obviously, are also responsible for creating some employment. So there's that problem of just corporate power, basically. It's an economic problem because, you tend to see bigger businesses with more market power able to pay lower wages, maybe kind of, gouge their suppliers, just able to behave in ways that smaller businesses might not. But there's also a political question here, which is that when you get an economy that's dominated by a small number of very, very powerful firms, those firms tend to get a lot of political influence as well. And we see this, all over the world, particularly in the US, for example, with Amazon and Uber being able to lobby various different state governments for kind of giveaways. And that's a real danger in the post-pandemic world. And the issue that we're going to see is that the government really isn't going to have much of an interest in ameliorating this inequality. It can largely do over the short term most of the things it needs to do to win votes through the combination of policies that we've seen in recent years, which the foundation of which has basically been this kind of quantitative easing program that's pushed up asset prices and supported the wealth of homeowners. Of course, whether or not you own a home is one of the biggest determinants as to which party you're going to vote for. So the Conservatives have an interest in basically, they can largely ignore a lot of what happens amongst those on lower wages and lower incomes, at least over the short term, whilst maintaining the wealth of those at the top, with basically some giveaways, as we've seen already in the budget, particularly to Conservative areas, and also through this program of asset purchases, which is, yes, not actual government policy. It's done by the Bank of England, but it works very well for the Conservatives at the moment. Of course, over the long run, this is completely unsustainable because it implies either lower levels of demand in the economy as a whole, because people on lower incomes tend to spend more. So if they're not spending as much, that's bad. But also, if not that, then rising debt again. So even higher levels of debt at the lower end of the income spectrum, which, as we've seen in the past, is not a sustainable way to organise an economy. Obviously, what that's. Sorry. I stop, do I? Sorry, right, okay.
No, but if you could just start to.
So I think, in that world, what we're going to see, and I think we're already seeing this, is the Conservatives basically trying to suppress dissent through a move towards authoritarianism, which is what we've seen with various different bills that have been passed recently, like the Overseas Operations Bill, the Police Bill, all these different things, which are basically a kind of authoritarian move amongst what under Cameron and Osborne could have been described as kind of more liberal party. And that is, I think, aimed at basically those who are not going to benefit from the post-pandemic settlement. So really, we need to be organising. We need to be organising that very large group of people who are going to experience the sharp end of this inequality in the post-pandemic world. And one of the best ways to do that is through this Green New Deal. So this is about creating good, unionized, sustainable jobs in sectors that we're going to need for the foreseeable future. So, the care sector, for example, really green sector across many, many metrics, and also something that is going to be really important as we see this massive increase in kind of demographic aging. And also just, we've seen the importance of health and care work during the pandemic as well. So investment in a national care service, perhaps as part of a Green New Deal, which also invests in infrastructure, research and development, the kind of, technological innovation along green lines. All of these things are going to be really, really important. But I think the key point to take away here is that a Green New Deal doesn't just mean more money for big business, because the Conservative Party is likely to say, right, we're going to do something along the lines of a Green New Deal, but actually it's just going to be a big giveaway for our mates in the private sector. We need to be campaigning for a Green New Deal that means investment in creating socialized assets and resources. So investment in, decommodifying the things that we need to survive, alongside creating new shared collective assets that are going to provide the foundations for a sustainable recovery and a sustainable future. And I will end there because I've probably gone over my time. Sorry.
Thank you, Grace. Brilliant contribution. I wanted you to touch on the Green New Deal, which is why I did let you run on a little bit there. But I think, you know, some of the points that you made about this rise in monopoly power and political power and the authoritarianism, we're seeing that, aren't we? So it's, you know, and I think the Green New Deal is the way out of all of this. So thank you for that. Okay, so I'm going to go on to our next speaker now. So Rachel Hopkins, we look forward to hearing from Rachel, who's obviously hopefully going to talk to us about full employment with health and the local economy. So over to you, Rachel.
Thanks, Nadia. And Grace, you can have 2 minutes of my time any day, because I could listen to you for forever. Hi, everybody. I'm Rachel Hopkins. I'm MP for Luton South, and I went into Parliament just in 2019. Prior to that, I was a local councillor for 10 years, and I want to draw on my experiences of being, you know, a Labour activist, a Labour councillor, and the impact of employment or unemployment on health. I went into my local council, and I was soon a member on the executive responsible for public health in our town. And I was going to these conversations with, you know, NHS people, GPs, public health officials, and they were using big fandango language, you know, like population health. And when I got beneath all these big things, I was saying, so if people live in a decent home and have good work and can afford to feed themselves and their family and clothe themselves and maybe treat themselves now and then, they're going to be healthier. And fundamentally, that was the answer, yes. And for me, I then feel an obligation to translate that from our grassroots and our individuals into, you know, the big macroeconomic stuff that people far more clever than me, like Larry and Grace, will talk about. We know that social, economic and environmental conditions are the strongest determinants of people's health. Whether it's having, like I say, a healthy home, a safe home, whether they've got a financial safety net if they need it, like social security, they can afford food, and importantly, the quality and the remuneration, or you know, fundamentally, a fair day's pay for a fair day's work. I know very much in loads of areas, so many activists and so many councils are doing small projects linked to their food banks to make sure people can eat, linked to uniform exchanges so children can have, you know, uniforms they feel dignified in going to school in. And you know, recently we've seen the digital poverty being addressed by small groups. But for me, when you add so many of these things up, it's like, well, if we had decent work that paid well, that meant that people could live in dignity, we wouldn't need to isolate these small projects that local authorities have desperately been trying to work on with charities in particularly in my area and up and down the country. So for me, that focus on full employment, good work, is really, really important. We know just recently the Marmot review, 10 years on report about health inequalities, and the huge increase in health inequalities in England particularly points dramatically to the social and economic conditions over the last 10 years of Tory austerity. You know, that's led to increased unemployment, which has led to in-work poverty and unemployment, which is extremely stressful. You know, living in poverty, if you have to think every day how you're going to feed yourself and feed your family, you're not always going to make reasoned decisions about other things in your life. Sometimes we see really difficult behaviours from people who are just fundamentally struggling. It impacts on their mental health, it impacts on their physical health, and can end in a downward spiral. But it's also that low quality, low paid work which has a massive impact on health and well-being, and we've seen how that's been increasing over recent years. They have just gathering my thoughts again, sorry. With the Tory government having this commitment to sort of a free market ideology, which has created a much more insecure job market. And part of that is unemployment's acceptable, which I fundamentally disagree with. But also, if work doesn't lead to being able to meet your basic needs, or it's insufficient to live a decent, healthy life, or if you have to just have insecure work and just rely on a 0 hours contract where you might get some hours, but that constant concern that, you know, how are you going to survive? It just puts immense pressure on our communities, who then really struggle. And we've seen a huge increase in work poverty. and there's some people would quote better stats than me. I mean, some that, you know, I found that there were in the middle of 2018, 780,000 people on 0 hours contracts. Yet 18 months later, February 2020, nearly 1 million. You know, we've seen an increase as well of people who are self-employed. So 20 years ago, it's about 11-12%. Now it's 15%, which is the highest on record. But what we've also seen, and particularly through the pandemic and the recognition, there's been a lack of support for some people who are nominally self-employed. But for me, I've seen that as the balance of risk of being employed has been shunted onto individuals rather than being absorbed by employers. And again, that I can see it day in, day out, where that leads to increased instability in families. It's a false self-employment in some respects, I believe. We've seen over the last year with the pandemic, we've had many debates and conversations around how health and wealth, you know, health and the economy are absolutely interlinked. And that's also prior to the pandemic as well, with austerity, when we've seen a decline in the economy, has seen also a decline in life expectancy in England. The average life expectancy at birth in 2020 had dropped by 1.3 years for men and by 0.9 years for women compared to the previous year. And overall, since 2010, overall life expectancy has been stalling. And that's not happened since at least 1900. And so if health has stopped improving, I think that's something where, you know, society has stopped improving. And it's just, you know, so awful to see on a day-to-day basis in my town, in the ward where I grew up, 10 minutes walk away from here, where 65% of children live in poverty. And there are gaps in the life expectancy of children living on one side of my town compared to the other of a number of years. And I still think that the way out of that, it links into a full employment strategy. We know that life expectancy follows that social gradient, as in the more deprived the area you live in, the shorter the life expectancy. And the Marmot review also showed how that gradient has increased as well. Particularly, we've seen life expectancy for women in the most deprived 10% of areas fall between 2010-12 and 2016-18. So before coronavirus, some of those big ticket stats with the 14.5 million people were living in poverty, which is 1 in 5 people. And there's been little overall change in poverty levels for more than 15 years. And yet, you know, we've also seen a more precarious labour market, as I've mentioned earlier and talked by others, you know, more of those groups who are living at the lower levels of the economy have borne the brunt of the economic crisis of the pandemic. You know, others have spoken a heck of a lot, whether it's part-time workers, low-paid workers, those in sectors where there's much higher rates of in-work poverty. If it's, you know, we've seen in many hospitality industries, for example. In my town, we've seen a disproportionate impact on Black, Asian and minority ethnic households, lone parents who are mostly women, and those in the private rented sector who've been struggling as well with increased debt, as Grace mentioned earlier. We know that incomes were falling for people prior to the pandemic, and even after housing. So a Joseph Rowntree Foundation report, the average income after housing was slightly lower in 2018-19 than in 2016-17, taking into account inflation. And there was a bigger fall in incomes for people in the fifth of the population with that lowest after housing cost income. And it is being predominantly driven by reduction in people's incomes from benefits as well, due to the freeze in benefit rates between 2016 and 2020, and the caps on things like the 2-child limit, and all those things that are all being squeezing down as a result of Tory austerity. So one of the things that our local council has done, which cuts to the chase, but it's sad to see, is set out a 20-year strategy, a vision for Luton in 2040, and it simply says, no one in poverty. And, you know, in this day and age, when that's your baseline, it's absolutely needed, but we can do better than that. And I think that's why I absolutely think that a full employment strategy where there are decent jobs that people can access, that are skilled for, that are near to where they live, that will help them, you know, live in decent housing, feed their family, have a decent life, is absolutely vital. It's not just about tinkering around the edges of maybe looking at this bit here and maybe looking at that bit there. You need a much bigger strategy set out by others really well about where you could achieve that. And I also think it's now for us to really keep making that case. And I'll just give a bit away about my age. Back in the 80s, I was a kid, and I was really taken by the big marches I went on. But they were people marching for the right to have a job. And I was there, and it really stuck with me. Then it was the miners' strike. And we, you know, it was just this, I asked those questions. I was growing up, and then I was a teenager, like, what is this about? And it's the dignity that comes with having a job that also ensures that you can live a decent life and a healthy life. And I think this is where absolutely we need to keep fighting for that. And as you know, Larry said as well, we need to make the case as a Labour Party, an economic case for economic justice, an ambitious policy for full employment, that we have well-paid, good jobs that give people and communities a greater stake in their local economy. It reduces health inequalities, improves health outcomes. And they're the big posh words that you use when you're in a council meeting. But fundamentally, I want everyone in my town, in my constituency, to have a nice life, a healthy life, and one that's filled with joy and pride and dignity.
Thank you so much, Rachel. That was a great contribution there. So just to remind people, there will be a Q&A at the end, so please do put your questions forward for the panel. And I'm going to move on to our next speaker. So Ben Chaku. Ben is the editor of the Morning Star, your daily dose of socialism. So over to you, Ben.
Thanks very much. I think people will all be aware watching this that we face a joblessness crisis in the country that has been linked to the pandemic. The Resolution Foundation found last month that around 2 million people have been without work for at least 6 months. About 4.5 million are on the job retention scheme or furlough, and half of those people expect to lose their jobs as soon as government support is withdrawn. So this is obviously linked to the pandemic, and sectors such as retail and hospitality have been especially hard hit, with hundreds of thousands of job losses. And the pandemic has intensified and exposed pre-existing inequalities, as well as has been mentioned. The employment rate has fallen much faster for Black people, for example, than it has for white people. And women are both more likely to have lost their jobs than men, and more likely to have seen their incomes cut if they've kept their jobs than men. But the joblessness crisis was not created by the pandemic. It's been with us for some time. If we take a sector like retail, unions like USDOR were calling for action to save our high streets long before the pandemic because of store closures and job losses. And the decline in high street shopping is an area that you can say is driven by technology because of the rise of online shopping. But there are other factors that drive it as well. Long working hours and long commutes, meaning people don't have time to shop. Poverty pay and mass unemployment, meaning people don't have money to shop. So the decline in high street shopping is linked to a social and economic model that imposes low pay, long hours, and people travelling long distances to work. And unemployment dictated by a social and economic model applies way beyond the retail sector. To people of my generation and younger, I was born under Thatcher, the existence of mass unemployment seems normal and possibly inevitable, but actually it's not. There's a line in Mark Steele's book, Reasons to be Cheerful, where he mentions learning under Thatcher that unemployment had hit 3 million and thinking, oh, 3 million unemployed, that's the kind of thing you read about in the history books. It's not allowed to happen now. Because before Thatcher, full employment used to be a goal of government, an expectation of government, and that all changed. There's a bit of a myth promoted by free market zealots that there's something artificial about the government creating jobs. So you hear this kind of Keynesian analogy of men being paid to dig holes and then fill them in. But actually the current system destroys lots of useful jobs that profit-driven operations think they can't afford. So to take one example, if we look in transport, the relentless drive by government and employers to get rid of guards on trains and conductors on buses. The public actually want guards on trains. People don't just feel safer with guards on trains, they are safer. The RMT unions repeatedly flagged the rise in crimes, including violent crimes on trains, as staff numbers are cut. And of course, given recent events, I think that we should be, very alert to the importance of keeping people safe on public transport. So guards are useful, but to a profiteering company, they aren't profitable, so they can be dispensed with. And if that means more people are going to be robbed or assaulted, then tough luck. Actually, we should look at things like guards on trains as we look at the fire brigade. They aren't there to make a profit, they're there to provide a useful service. And there's lots of other examples of how paring things to the bone results in a worse service. You could, even within transport, looking at the collapse of bus services outside the biggest urban areas. So without even touching on the number of useful things we ought to be doing in this country that we're not doing, like the Green New Deal that Grace talked about, even just in ordinary everyday maintenance of current systems, we ought to be employing more people than we are. We need a different approach, one that doesn't allow the market to dictate outcomes, but allows us as citizens to decide what outcomes we want and then take action to reach them. So one of those outcomes should be full employment, because we know the huge waste of human potential, the debilitating effect on families and whole communities that mass unemployment creates. But also because there are a hell of a lot of useful things that need doing, which aren't necessarily going to provide an immediate return for an investor. Unions such as the CWU have pointed to the unsustainable character of the current profit extractive model, especially in a world of short-term shareholdings and ownership dominated by a handful of footloose transnationals who have no long-term interest in the welfare of a company or even a country. So you see companies being asset stripped and dumped, and the workers and communities they served cast aside. Or the most profitable parts of a service are hived off, and what's left is declared unsustainable. We saw that in Royal Mail, where they were trying to hive off the parcels sector, because of course with online shopping, parcels are a growing sector, and then claim that letters don't make any money and get rid of the universal service obligation as a result. And then everyone's a loser. The CW has seen that off in Royal Mail for now, which I think is a very, very important victory. But the destruction of services in this way is a direct cause of unemployment. But in a broader sense, an economy designed to extract profit is an economy that doesn't deliver good outcomes for people. Because mass unemployment reduces workers' bargaining power, and we're seeing that in fire and rehire at the moment, it drives down pay and conditions for people who are employed as well. So there's an economic case for full employment. But I also think there's a political need for the labour movement to take up the battle for jobs as a unifying national campaign. The sense that things can't go on as they are is widespread. We've seen a big revival of socialist thinking in Britain in recent years, with Corbynism obviously. But what's less remarked on is how the polarisation that we saw in British politics showed an almost universal rejection of the status quo. There was some overlap between Brexit supporters and Corbyn supporters, including me and some of the other people on this panel, but there wasn't much of an overlap. And if support for Brexit and support for Corbyn both indicated deep dissatisfaction with the status quo, as I believe they both did, we're actually talking about a big majority of the population expressing that dissatisfaction. So the challenge for the political left is to unite all this dissatisfaction in a movement for socialist change and a people-centred economy. And a weakness that we have there is that most people aren't organised. Trade unions only represent about 1 in 4 workers. So at a time of enormous and widespread anxiety over jobs, joblessness can be a pivotal issue that unites millions of people in a fight to create and defend jobs. And we can fight for a popular understanding that full employment is possible and desirable. It's good for your pay packet if you are in work. It's good for your small business. And actions like the hunger marches that have been, we've mentioned the marches for jobs of the 80s. There were the hunger marches in the 1930s again for jobs. They draw the whole country's attention. A big initiative like a new Jarrow March could do that, bringing people into the orbit of the labour movement. And that's what we need to do, because we keep losing the popular vote to the Tories in this country, even at a time of profound social unrest. We have to mount a campaign that looks outwards and brings new people into the orbit of the labour movement. And I don't think there's any campaign that can do that as effectively as a campaign for full employment. Thanks.
Brilliant, Ben. Thank you so much for that. And I totally agree. And I think it's this social unrest that we've seen in history, and isn't it? It's about learning from that as well. So thank you for that. Okay, so our final speaker is John Trickett. John, not only is he an MP, he's the co-founder of No Holding Back, and someone who's been doing so much important campaigning around the economic policy and justice issues for a number of years now. I think, John, you may have some slides as well. So
I'm hoping the slides are going to appear as if by magic. Let me just say,
there they are.
Here we are. And let me just say that first, I very much agree with all of the panelists. I think this argument about politics, how would you build a majority? what issues can pull people together, middle-class people, city dwellers, rural dwellers, the poor, and so on. I think around the nature of work is a key issue. And by the way, if we manage to create full employment, then the power of the working class, if you define the working class in the broadest possible way, is incredibly well enhanced, because the bosses know that workers can walk away and find another job. So for all sorts of political reasons and ethical and health reasons, the fight for full employment should be at the centre of what we're doing. I'll put together some slides. We can't do justice to the slides in 7 minutes, but I'm going to try to just give you the essence. So if you can move fairly quickly, whoever's controlling it. So British capitalism has managed to create, and capitalism more generally, but let's focus on Britain. There is huge human need in our country and across the world, as we all know, and yet there is massive productive capacity simply lying idle. There are millions out of work or massively underemployed. There are billions of pounds which are unused. Our services are not funded. The food bank's on the rise, and so on. The planet is in trouble, as we know. All of these needs remain unmet, and yet we have resources which are simply locked up and left idle. And let me just quickly go through some of the numbers for you. Here are the figures for unemployment and underemployment, people struggling to find a full-time permanent job. There are 4.7 million people furloughed, half of whom we think may be facing job losses. The number of people underemployed is quite staggering. Let's just move on quickly. If you think about the number of people also in insecure work, which the other panelists have mentioned, 5.5 million less than the living wage. There are so many, 1 million part-timers, they can't find a full-time job. 1.5 million seeking more secure work, and so on and so forth. So let's just keep on moving forward as quick as we can. The point about all of that is not only that people are potentially able to work, create wealth, meet the needs of our society, the needs of our planet, but it's costing money to keep people idle and or on low wages. And here are the people who are being subsidized. 2.3 million working households receiving credit, universal credit. The housing benefit, it's 1.5 million households, not individuals, households. 1.4 million on working tax credits, and so on and so forth. 3.6 million, I think, in poverty and in work. These are staggering numbers of people. Let's keep on going forward, please. Next thing. What is the cost to our economy of what is really failure of the capitalist system? Let's be quite explicit about what we're talking about here. Well, the figures are enormous. It costs 31 billion to basically subsidize crap employers paying low wages. It costs 8.3 billion pounds in unemployment benefit, and that's bound to rise. We're spending nearly 54 billion pounds on furlough, and so on and so forth. 48 billion pounds reduction in output. If everybody was working, you could create a huge amount more wealth in the country on a year-by-year basis in the tens of billions of pounds. Next slide. There's another issue which we haven't talked about so far. I want to just raise it quickly. Huge regions of the country are unproductive because there's been no investment there. In my home county, the wonderful county of Yorkshire, we'll allow Humber to be part of it for now anyway. We have an average output per person of just over 21,000. The average for the UK as a whole is 27,000. The average in London is 48,000 pounds. Now, here's the thing. If you were to bring Yorkshire up to the same level of output as the UK average, it would create 33 billion pounds extra output just from Yorkshire and the Humber alone. Spread through the rest of the country, and you can see the massive amount of wealth which could be created. It could deal with student debt. It could pay the nurses a proper income, and so on and so forth. It could begin to build houses and to pay for new infrastructure as well. This is the cost of underinvestment in our economy, which you've got to put together with the cost of keeping people out of work and on low wages. Here's we've just imagined, let's just say we get 1 million people back to work, just 1 million. And our objective should be obviously to get everybody a decent job. It would create 27 billion pounds additional output. It would create £5 billion increase in tax, 8.6 billion reduction in unemployment benefit, and so on and so forth. More money being spent in the local economy because the multiplier effect of working people getting income, more incomes, is much bigger than the multiplier effect of billions adding to the wealth of the already millionaires and billionaire class which we have in our society. Next slide. Now, people will say to us, well, the country, yeah, great, good old John, you know, he wants to get everybody back to work. Well, we're all in favour of motherhood and apple pie, but we can't afford it. Well, look, we've heard from Larry and others today about quantitative easing and other ways of creating money in the economy. But here's the weird thing about it. Nobody mentions that there's a fact that there is £1 trillion almost of unused cash lying in the bank accounts of the largest companies in Britain. £1 trillion, enough to tackle most of the problems facing our economy. £1 trillion is a third of the annual output of the whole of our economy, and it's lying there in cash unused. Last year, there was £60 billion worth of dividends paid in the London Stock Exchange. The value of companies on the London Stock Exchange increased by £600 billion in 6 months. So we can choose to mobilise our unused productive capacity in labour, in people being left at home, stressed and with mental health issues, feeling ill and with, as we've heard, declining mortality and morbidity rates. We have the labour power there, and we have the capital there, and we have money which will be created by putting people back to work. All of that unused productive capacity, we have to say, is a product itself of the capitalist system, which is so inefficient at using resources. We could and we can deliver a world which is free of need and begin to liberate every one of us from the drudgery of so much menial, unskilled work, or worse still, the drudgery of staying at home, wondering how to heat the house and feed the kids. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, John. £1 trillion of unused money. Staggering, isn't it? Okay, so we've got our first round of questions. So I'm going to go to Grace first. So Grace, this is about 3 questions actually. Should be 1, but it's about 3. So do you believe the capitalist system can ever deliver social justice? How do we ensure a Green New Deal that creates wealth for society and it's not just for investors? And when is the left going to start to make the case for public ownership? So over to you, Grace.
I'm muted. A lot of questions. I'll start with the first one. I don't think that the capitalist system is ever capable of delivering social justice, because it is a system that is, definition of capitalism is the commodity production for profit. And the logic of that system is premised upon endless accumulation. If you have a system that is geared towards profitability, it is wired for endless accumulation for a number of different reasons, but primarily because, you can imagine having enough, of any one commodity, but it is often impossible to imagine having enough money, this like abstract idea of value that people can kind of imagine accumulating endlessly. And that is really kind of the rot that exists at the heart of this system. And obviously, the way in which that production takes place is always premised upon the construction and maintenance of a divide between different classes, people who own all the stuff and the people who work for a living. So, as long as we have that system, I don't believe that we'll ever really be able to deliver social justice. The question is how we get from here to there. And for me, and for a lot of other Marxists working and looking at modern capitalism today, the question really comes down to that idea of class power. So, in a world where it's possibly not conceivable to imagine kind of overthrowing capitalism, the real aim, I think, for all of us has to be about building the power of the working classes in order to get to a situation in which, so in order to change the kind of structure of society, and that both influences what goes on within the state. So I don't want to get too bogged down in any theory here, but we can imagine the state as kind of a set of institutions that reflects and reinforce the wider balance of power within society. So changing what goes on in wider society and increasing the power of organised labour helps to shift state policy, as well as actively redistributing resources from one class to another by allowing us to organise. So yeah, again, that point about being able to organise in order to shift the balance of power within society is really important. And one of the biggest and most crucial elements there is, of course, the labour movement. And the labour movement, it's not a coincidence that Thatcher came to power and immediately waged war on the labour movement, because that was the condition that facilitated all the other policies that she implemented, which would otherwise have been resisted. So empowering the labour movement is going to be really, really important. And we're going to have to think differently about how we do that in an age of insecure employment, in an age of individualism, really, where people are parceled off into vastly different places of work and types of work and conditions of work. How we kind of bring people together is a real challenge for the modern labour movement today, as are the structural conditions created by a state that is consistently, and it's not just Thatcher, it's been every Conservative government since then, has consistently tried to disempower workers. So that has to be, I think, the cornerstone of any transition towards a socialized economic and political system.
Thank you so much for that, Grace. So the next question is for Larry, and it is: should Labour openly state that the fiscal deficit and the national debt are irrelevant statistics in evaluating economic policies, and that the main statistics of importance are the rate of unemployment and inflation?
I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think everything that we've seen over the last 12 months is that the government doesn't pay any mind to the level of the deficit and the national debt in an emergency. I mean, effectively, the economy has been put on a war footing, and in wartime, the chance of the exchequer and the fiscal deficit cease to be that relevant. I mean, that's what history shows us from the Second World War, that when the economy has got its back to the wall, then all the orthodoxy goes out of the window. And one thing we've learned from the last 10 years is that the fetish for austerity and balancing the books is an absolutely pointless exercise. I mean, that's one thing the government has learned from bitter experience, which was that after 2010, when the Tories got in 2010, they prioritised deficit reduction, they imposed austerity, and what happened was we had much lower levels of growth and a much higher level of the deficit and a much higher level of debt than we would have had they allowed the economy to grow. So, Keynes used to say that, you look after the economy, look after employment, and the deficit will look after itself. And that's the message that I would give to the Labour Party. Concentrate on getting people into work, concentrate on full employment, and the deficit will look after itself. Don't make a fetish of it, because it's absolutely pointless and self-destructive.
Thank you, Larry. And yeah, we know that austerity was a political choice, don't we? So thanks for that reply. So the next question is for Rachel. So many social beneficial jobs have been lost from local authorities because of the withdrawal of the central grant. The government is the monopoly supplier of the pounds and doesn't have to borrow. Why isn't Labour pushing for direct funding of local authorities to restore these jobs?
Very good question. And I can say, those top line things, it's 60p in every pound has been taken away from local authorities over the last 10 years of austerity. And, I'll talk about my local area. We had 138 million quid stripped away, and that has resulted in poorer lives for our constituents, despite a Labour council doing what it can with what it's got. We did all the efficiency things that they wanted us to do, and we're literally down to brass tacks making differences. I would like to absolutely see that return to a more redistributive approach, taking into account of need and deprivation and those indicators, so that it's absolutely targeted where it will have most effect. The shift by the Tory government to just sort of say, no, it's per capita, absolutely does nothing to, as I talked about earlier, say reduce inequalities and help our local communities thrive. Some of us will keep pushing for that, and I think it's key. Our local authorities and Labour councils up and down the country are absolutely been at the forefront, both of trying to support their communities through 10 years of austerity, but on the front line of getting us through coronavirus. And having worked in the public sector all my life and being a local councillor, the value of public service should not be underestimated.
Thank you for that, Rachel. So the next question is for John. Have we given up on welfare statism in order to go for job creation come what may? Well,
let me just say, the biggest beneficiaries of welfare statism are big companies. They're literally having billions of pounds bunged at them in direct grants with no conditions at all, in bungs from Tory ministers giving it to their mates in business, and in also the subsidies, as I've described, as we all know, to low pay. So you can have basically scabby employers paying poverty wages. What happens is the state then steps in to lift people up to what they call about the poverty line, although I sometimes think actually, people are, they are really struggling even on benefits and so on. So I'm not in favor of that kind of corporate, it's socialism for the corporations and the rest can go to the walls. And I'm not in favor of that at all. The second point I'd make about statism, you mentioned welfare statism. I'm not completely in favor of old-fashioned statism as top-down command and control kind of left-wing view was at one time. Manderson's granddad, Morrison, was one of the people who did all that. I'm not wanting to argue against the government, but he doesn't work in the Google age, quite frankly. And then my third point about welfareism for the poor is this is what New Labour did. And remember, I worked in Downing Street on 2 separate occasions. In effect, I worked for Gordon Brown in the last couple of years. My argument then was what New Labour was doing was trying to tackle poverty pay and poverty benefits. And we introduced a lot of the system which still remains today. But what was really happening was a fiscal transfer from middle-class workers to lower-paid workers. There was a transfer within the working class. If you say that the working class as a whole consists of everybody who works for a living, there are 33 million people in blue-collar, white-collar jobs who receive a wage or a salary. And my argument was actually we were leaving wealth untouched. And so I wasn't convinced that the pension and credit system and all the support for low wages and people unemployed and so on was actually handled properly. It would be far better over time to drive up unemployment into secure jobs where people know that they've got a job, and it's a job with a purpose. It's a meaningful job. It gives that person agency over their life. And then the benefit system will then begin to not need to support them. And it would in itself empower working people to make reasonable, just demands of their employers. But there's one final thing, which is this. There are some people who are unable to work for one reason or another. And it's absolutely essential that we understand that. We're not here, I'm not here, I'm sure none of us are here, to say that work is an obligation for people who are not able to work. That is not the point we're making. There should be a proper system which safety nets people who for one reason or another are unable to work. That needs to give them a proper, decent, comfortable standard of life. And therefore, yes, I do defend absolutely the right for people to have a decent income where possible. I think people that I represent, and I can only speak for them and also for my family and myself as somebody who works, I'm a building worker by trade, would want to work if they can, providing it's decent work and it's well paid. So I think just a final point, really, just when I've got the microphone sort of thing, economics, the political economy, understand how the money works in a capitalist society is the key to building a political alliance which could create a majority in the country. It's also the key to understanding what it is that's wrong with the society we live in. But somewhere a long time ago, but I'm an old man, down the track, I know that we talked about economics and nothing else, probably ad nauseum, But we need to go back to our economic analysis, because that will enable the left to develop a strategy to begin to tackle the underlying problems which our country is facing.
Thank you, John. I have got some more questions for you, though, so you will be coming back in. I think it's important, though, that you've talked there about the safety net for people that can't work, so that people don't get a misunderstanding around what's being talked about today. So thank you for that. Okay, so the next question is for Ben. So Ben, how does UBI fit into full employment?
Well, I mean, I think that there may be a case during the pandemic, because we've seen the difficulty of coming up with furlough arrangements that cover everyone in a really, a labour market which is dominated by all kinds of bogus self-employment and, contracting out and so on. Working out who somebody's employer is and where money's got to go is quite difficult. But I think that a full employment strategy has advantages over UBI as a general policy. I think a universal basic income risks acting as a subsidy for business to underpay workers. I think that, as a number of other speakers have mentioned, most people want to work. Obviously there needs to be a welfare state and a system of social security benefits that are appropriate to people who can't work, and for people who do work in certain circumstances such as child benefit and so on. But what we've seen consistently is that people like to have control over their lives, like to have agency, they like to have a job, because it gives them those things. And that applies to disabled people just as much as it applies to everyone else. One of the worst things that the Cameron and Osborne government did was, at the same time as it was pursuing these really punitive fit for work assessments, it was also just closing down all the Remploy factories, closing down the actual employers which had made adaptations to allow people to enter work if there were particular difficulties for them to do so. So although I'm not, I'm not an economist, I'm not going to kind of rule on UBI in that sense. I think it is a reflection of the fact that the Labour movement has stopped talking about full employment, that UBI has become a big demand. And actually, I think full employment is a more progressive, more socialist demand.
Brilliant, thank you for that, Ben. I'm going to go back to you, Rachel, with this question. I haven't named who the questions are from, but I will on this one. So this is from Stan, who is going to be a candidate in the local elections coming up. So kudos for that, Stan. But one of the points that is being made is that speaking to many people, they find that they do relate to the socialist agenda, they do understand that, but it's the media suppression that prevents a true understanding of the rigged system that we're fighting. And how do we make the public more aware? I think it's a great question, because I think just from personal experience of door knocking, people often blame Labour for austerity because their local councils are Labour. So if you could respond to that, Rachel.
Great question. Good luck, Stan. I absolutely support anyone who puts themselves forward to stand for Labour in our council elections. It is really difficult. We know that there is just right-wing hostile media who will pump out whatever they want to say, which is why, and I'm a bit boring, but I have said so many times in my local CLP, in my local branch, when are we going out door knocking and when are we talking to people? Because it's our personal contacts. And what I was trying to say in my bit around being able to explain what Larry and Grace can set out here and Ben explains here in a really grassroots, nuts and bolts way. And actually, having spent some time doing phone banking over the last few weeks, I know we meant to do it quite quickly and chunk through it. I've had some really good conversations about people feeling heard. And sometimes it's about just feeling listened to rather than told to. And then by the end of the conversation, I said, I wish they all were like you. When all I did was listen to their concerns. And then gently, when you find the right avenue, you can start talking about, well, what if this was an alternative? What if there's some really good jobs that were just up the road that are being created and your son or daughter could go and get them, and then they would be able to move out down the line, those sorts of things, to actually show them there is an alternative. Because what I really struggle with is so many people over decades of being told, as was referred to earlier, this is the way it is now, don't actually understand there is an alternative. And it's up to us as activists and us as the Labour movement to actually get out and tell those stories in a way that people understand on their terms. And sometimes it's those frank conversations on the doorstep to help people understand. And one of the biggest things ever is people don't like being told they're wrong. And people, if they don't understand it, like being told that they might be a bit silly because they don't understand it. We need to be patient at times to help them understand it themselves. But it's not easy. And I do think all things like this, where we're using social media to reach out in a different way, we're using it on our own terms. I've seen trade unions do it. I've seen all our, different left platforms do it. That's another avenue, and particularly with people who are more likely to be using social media than having those conversations on the doorsteps. But it's for us to keep talking about it in a way that people can understand and build it into that movement that we've talked about today, so that people like feeling part of something if they're able to. And I think we need to give them that opportunity to do it. And it's tiring and it's knackering talking to people, but keep up the good fight, and good luck, Stan.
Thank you for that, Rachel. And I think left media is so important, isn't it? And we're quite lucky. We've got some really good left media at the minute. So, okay, so there's a last couple of questions here. So Larry, this one's directed at you. So it says, Larry Elliott suggests the mandate of the Bank of England should be extended to cover employment. Why should that change anything? The Bank of England can only play around with interest rates, but monetary policy is a very limited tool to affect aggregate demand. Don't we need a huge public sector investment, which means a much bigger national debt?
Yeah, okay, very good question. My point about the Bank of England is the Bank of England can be quite negative for the economy if it's just got a mandate to control inflation. If inflation starts to rise to a level that the Bank of England thinks is inappropriate, it can raise interest rates and choke off recovery and cost jobs. So that's the point, really. I mean, what I'm not saying is that just giving the Bank of England a dual mandate is the panacea for all our problems. What I'm saying is that we should actually exert more political control over the Bank of England. I wasn't in favour of the Bank of England becoming independent under Gordon Brown, because I didn't really think that the Bank of England can ever be truly independent. It's such a pivotal part of the economy, and it needs some political direction. I mean, the second part of the question is obviously absolutely right, that you can't just run a full employment economy on the basis of the Bank of England keeping interest rates low and having a dual mandate. You do need to actually have a treasury also, which is borrowing for investment and public investment for the long term, and using the fact that interest rates are very low to borrow money for that purpose. So, I mean, I agree with the questioner. Yeah, it's important that the Treasury rethinks its entire approach. I mean, this is the whole basis of what we've been talking about today. That up until 1979, full employment was the key principle of economic policy in this country, and it ceased to be after 1979. And I think that where you start is by saying, well, what's been the record of that post-79 strategy? And to be honest, it's been pretty woeful. Lower levels of growth, lower levels of productivity, lower levels of investment, and more people now, the majority of people are in poverty, are in work. So the track record of the system that was set up to replace the full employment Britain has been a woeful failure. And I think that where we need to start is by saying, yeah, it's been really bad. We can do better and present a positive, upbeat, optimistic case for where we think this country can go. That's really what I'm saying here, that macroeconomic policy is a part of it, but it's only a part of an overall strategy of the left.
Thank you so much, Larry. So Grace has had to leave us for another event, so I'm going to put the last question to John. So John, mention was made of quantitative easing by the Bank of England, but the Tories and others are already talking of how to pay the debt back in order to justify austerity. But if we are to create jobs and do worthwhile things, we need to argue against that. So how do we get our message across? You're on mute.
Sorry.
Okay.
It's a mistake to think that austerity leads anywhere except to further decline, national decline. I mean, it is just as simple as that. I noticed some people, I'm not going to say who, in the party, some quite well-known people were saying we should do a tax on super profits and use it to pay down the debt. That, I think, is a mistake. It's a wrong track to go down. It's more progressive than cutting services, but it's still the wrong track to go down because, as I try to make clear in my presentation, look, there are huge resources in our society available in company bank accounts and in spending which supports unemployment or underemployment rather than driving forward to a greener economy, one which is more productive and rewarding for people. And that, I think, is what we should be doing. There is, in the end, only one way out of a critical fiscal problem, if that is what we have, and that is growth. If you can put people to work, the so-called welfare costs immediately begin to decline in the most dramatic way. And also there is more tax coming in. And thirdly, there's more demand in the economy because people will spend the money that they're earning. If it goes to the poorer sections of the population particularly, but also to middle class income earners as well. So that is a virtuous upwards cycle. Austerity is the reverse. It's a downward, whatever the opposite of virtuous is, downward cycle, downward spiral into further debt. Because if there's less activity in the economy, there's less money coming in, there's more benefit payments being made, and meanwhile the richer are getting richer and richer. What will happen? The social cohesion of our society will further fragment. The things which bind us together are being torn apart, and we know that. That explains the turn towards much more, certainly authoritarian government, because they fear, the British establishment fears what will happen if they continue down the track, which is what they apparently do. Labour should have nothing to do with that whatsoever, or the Labour movement, because what I think we should be thinking about is winning the argument. And at the moment, not everybody's making this argument, but they need to hear it. Winning the argument, building from the Labour movement out to all the various civil society groups and into the wider population, the case for an economy which is progressive and which employs all the resources at its disposal. So I'm not in favour of an austerity. I'm not even a left austerity or a right austerity. For me, it's austerity. It won't work. It should be rejected. We're on the right track here. There's more work to be done. There's more analysis to be done. But there's a case for everybody on this call, and we're expecting thousands to watch this call over the next 24 hours or so to get out and make the case for full employment. When 30 years ago, as Larry said, and Ben said as well, there were demonstrations, mass actions demanding a return to full employment. I remember when the left in Parliament took the mace and had a demonstration inside Parliament when unemployment was getting to certain levels. And we must never forget our burning anger at the injustice of a capitalist society, which says to people, we can't find any use for you, just go on the scrap heap, we're leaving you behind. The ethical case is overwhelming. So I hope this if I'm the last speaker, that this has been a useful conversation. It should be the start of much more. Our economists and our colleagues in the newspapers and Rachel and yourself on the NEC, Nadia, we all need to work on this. This is a central problem for our society.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that, John. And thank you to everyone that's attended today and our speakers. There's been some great contributions. Thanks for your questions. Obviously, we didn't get to go through all of those questions, but as John's just said, this is a really important discussion, and it isn't one that must stop here today. You know, this has got to be carried on in your local parties, in your unions, in the communities, that we fight for jobs and we fight for full employment. We've got to bring this back up on the agenda. So please make sure you follow No Holding Back, The Morning Star and Arise on social media, and come along to future events. There is, just give you an update, there is an event, an Arise event with Diane Abbott this Wednesday, and we do ask that you come along there, because that's all about the Tory attacks on our civil liberties and human rights, which all plays a part. So, as John said, let's build the resistance to this reactionary government and argue for people to come first. I want to be in a world where there is no need and we are free from need. So thank you, as I said, to everybody in solidarity, comrades.